Have you ever walked into a room and felt invisible? Have you spoken only to realize no one was really listening? Have you tried to prove your worth so many times that you started to feel small, like every word you offered was just background noise? What if the secret to being heard wasn't speaking louder but speaking less? What if the most powerful presence in the room was the one that didn't even need to explain itself? That's where our story begins. In the center of a glass-walled boardroom, executives argued over projections, marketing plans, and power plays. Their voices rose like a storm charts slammed down, fingers pointed, laughter forced. But in the corner sat one man. He said nothing. He didn't lean forward, didn't scramble for approval, didn't chase the spotlight. His silence wasn't weakness. It was gravity. At first, they ignored him. Then, one by one, they noticed. A nervous laugh, a stammer, a sudden need to explain themselves. It was as if his stillness turned into a mirror, forcing them to see their own insecurity. The louder they became, the smaller they looked next to him. And then a single moment changed everything. He looked up. Just one glance across the table, calm, unreadable, detached. The room froze. Papers stopped shuffling. A voice cracked mid-sentence. In that instant, everyone understood the man who spoke nothing had become the center of the room. He didn't win them over with charm or with a flawless pitch. He won because he refused to compete for their attention. His silence was not emptiness. It was presence. It was the unshakable confidence of someone who didn't need to be understood to matter. Maybe that's the pain you've been carrying, always explaining, always proving, always performing. And maybe the power you've been searching for comes not from giving more, but from holding back. This is only the beginning. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever wanted to turn silence into strength, stay with me. Subscribe and walk with me through this journey. Because the man who spoke nothing is about to show us everything. Have you ever felt drowned out by the noise around you? Do you ever scroll through endless posts, arguments, and performances and wonder, why does no one truly listen anymore? Do you ever catch yourself raising your voice, talking faster, explaining more, only to realize that the more you give, the less people value it? Isn't it exhausting always fighting to be heard in a world that only rewards the loudest? But here's the truth. In a storm of noise, silence is the loudest weapon. That boardroom was proof. Executives fought for dominance with numbers and jargon, their voices crashing into each other like waves in a storm. Each man, each woman desperate to prove their brilliance, their relevance, their control. And yet none of them noticed that their desperation was stripping them bare. The more they fought, the more predictable they became. Across the table, the silent man remained still. He didn't argue. He didn't defend. He didn't try to match their volume. And that restraint made him impossible to ignore. Slowly, the storm lost its power. Their words became frantic, their jokes forced. The louder they grew, the weaker they appeared beside the gravity of his silence. And that's when the room began to turn. People started glancing at him, searching for a reaction. They leaned toward him without even realizing it, as though silence itself was pulling them in. It wasn't what he said, it was what he refused to say. That's the paradox no one wants to admit. Noise demands attention, but silence commands it. Think about your own life. How many times have you tried to prove your worth by over-explaining, oversharing, overperforming? And how many times has it left you feeling smaller, not greater? What if the very thing you've been running from, silence, was the thing that could set you free? This is not about being passive. This is about weaponizing restraint. About turning down the noise so that when you finally do speak, every word lands like thunder. If you've ever felt like your voice gets lost in the chaos, this story is for you. Stay with me. Subscribe now, because silence is not weakness, it is power. And in the next chapter, you'll see how that power forces others to reveal more than they ever intended. Have you ever caught yourself talking too much just to fill the silence? Have you ever revealed secrets you later regretted simply because someone else didn't say a word? Have you ever wondered why some people seem to pull confessions out of you without even asking? Isn't it terrifying how silence can make you spill everything you were trying so hard to hide? That's exactly what happened in the boardroom. The executives, still trying to outshine one another, began to lean harder into their performances, but the silent man's stillness worked like a mirror. He gave them nothing. No nod, no smile, no approval. And because of that, they began to reveal themselves. One director stumbled into admitting missed targets. Another nervously joked about questionable expenses. A third, sweating under the weight of silence, started talking about internal politics he swore he'd never share. They weren't answering his questions because he hadn't asked any. They were answering the questions they imagined in his silence. That's the hidden law. When you stop feeding people your words, they project their insecurities onto your silence. They fill the void with their own fears, their own mistakes, their own desperate need to be validated. And here's the painful truth. You've probably lived this yourself. You've poured out explanations no one requested, told stories you didn't need to tell, confessed weaknesses that others later used against you. All because you couldn't handle the quiet. Because you thought silence meant you weren't being understood. But in reality, silence was never your enemy. It was your power waiting to be claimed. The man in the corner didn't demand their honesty. They gave it away for free. And in doing so, they handed him control of the entire room. That's what silence does. It doesn't force people to speak. It makes them desperate to. So ask yourself, are you filling the silence, or are you letting others fill it for you? This is where the real game begins. Don't miss what comes next. Subscribe now and follow along as we uncover how silence doesn't just expose others, it crowns the one who holds it. Have you ever felt someone's eyes on you and it made your heart race? Have you ever been in a room where one person didn't say a word yet you couldn't stop wondering what they were thinking? Have you ever realized that silence paired with a steady gaze can be more terrifying than 1,000 angry words? Isn't it haunting how just being watched can strip away your confidence? That's exactly what unfolded next. The silent man hadn't moved for most of the meeting. But then slowly, he lifted his eyes. No words, no gestures, just a calm, steady look that swept across the table. And suddenly, the room that had been buzzing with noise went quiet like a switch had been flipped. One executive who had been ranting moments earlier faltered. His voice cracked mid-sentence. Papers trembled in his hands. Another shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar as if that simple glance had pierced straight through his defenses. What happened? Nothing yet. Everything. The watcher didn't accuse, didn't confront, didn't threaten. But his silence paired with that unblinking focus forced everyone else to turn inward. They weren't afraid of him. They were afraid of what his eyes reflected back, their own flaws, their own lies, their own desperation to be seen as strong. That's the cruel truth, isn't it? You've felt it before. Someone looked at you, and you rushed to justify yourself, to explain, to prove you were worthy when they hadn't even asked a single question. Deep down, you weren't answering them. You were answering your own fear. The man in the corner understood this law perfectly. He didn't need to raise his voice or demand respect. His gaze did the work for him. He was the watcher, and in his watching, others collapsed under the weight of their own insecurity. And here's the lesson: the one who can control himself, his words, his emotions, even his eyes, will always end up controlling the room. If you've ever wanted that kind of presence, if you've ever wanted to stop performing and start commanding, stay close. Subscribe now, because in the next chapter we'll uncover how scarcity itself turns silence into the most valuable currency in the world. Have you ever felt taken for granted because you were always available? Have you ever given your time, your energy, your attention so freely that people stopped appreciating it? Have you ever noticed that the more you offer, the less respect you get? Isn't it painful realizing that your constant presence made you invisible? That's because what is common becomes cheap. What is rare becomes priceless. In the boardroom, this law came alive. The silent man still hadn't spoken more than a glance, but suddenly everyone wanted his approval. Executives who had once dismissed him leaned forward, eager for a nod, a reaction, even a flicker of acknowledgement. They began competing not for the spotlight, but for his attention. The irony: he never promised them anything. He never offered his praise, never gave validation. And because he gave so little, his silence became the most valuable thing in the room. Every man and woman there, no matter how powerful, began to treat his absence of words as if it were gold. That's the brutal truth of human psychology. The more accessible you are, the more they assume you'll always be there. The less you give, the more they fight for it. Scarcity isn't just about objects or money, it's about presence. And presence withheld becomes the ultimate luxury. Think about your own life. How many times have you bent over backwards for people who barely noticed? How many times have you over-delivered only to be undervalued? What if the real problem wasn't that they didn't care, but that you gave too much too easily? The man in that room understood, if everything is available, nothing is special. By offering almost nothing, he made every gesture rare, every look expensive, every moment unforgettable. And here's the lesson. When you stop handing out your attention like loose change, people start treating it like treasure. If you've ever felt invisible because you gave too much, this is your wake-up call. Stay with me. Subscribe now, because in the next chapter, you'll see how silence doesn't just create value, it turns the entire room cold when others realize they can't buy what you refuse to sell. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the air shift like suddenly no one wanted to breathe? Have you ever sensed tension so thick you could almost touch it, but you couldn't explain why? Have you ever realized that sometimes it isn't anger or shouting or chaos that changes the mood, but silence itself? Isn't it chilling when quiet makes everyone more afraid than rage ever could? That's what happened next in the boardroom. The executives had been shouting, debating, throwing their voices around like weapons. But then something strange began to happen. The silent man never raised his voice, never pounded the table, never demanded the floor. And yet the more he sat still, the colder the room became. One director adjusted his tie nervously. Another rubbed his hands together as if to chase away the chill. The man who had been most aggressive slammed his fist against the table, desperate to break the pressure. But instead of dominating the space, his anger only made him look smaller, weaker, almost childish. That's the paradox. Noise can heat up a room, but silence can freeze it solid. Everyone started to measure their words more carefully. They second-guessed themselves before speaking. They avoided his eyes. The silence wrapped around them like ice, and nobody knew how to break it. The loudest man in the room no longer controlled the energy. He looked like a fool fighting against something he couldn't touch. Here's the truth you already know deep down. You felt it before when someone refused to argue back, and suddenly your own voice sounded hollow. When you lashed out, but the other person didn't even flinch, and your anger burned itself out against a wall of calm. Silence doesn't just cool tempers, it exposes weakness. The man in the corner had turned the entire boardroom into a freezer, and while they shivered in discomfort, he sat untouched, untouchable. That was his power, not reacting, but letting others collapse under the weight of their own noise. If you've ever wanted that kind of control, the ability to command a room without saying a word, this journey is for you. Stay with me. Subscribe now, because in the next chapter you'll see how silence becomes more than just a chill. It becomes gravity, the invisible force that pulls everyone toward the man who needs nothing. Have you ever noticed how some people pull a room toward them without even trying? Have you ever wondered why everyone leans in when they speak, or even when they stay quiet? Have you felt that sting of being the one who has to fight for attention, while someone else barely lifts a finger and still gets it all? Isn't it frustrating when you give everything, but the one who gives nothing becomes the center? That's the law of invisible gravity, and in that boardroom, it came alive. The silent man had not moved much. He hadn't spoken more than a single sentence. Yet, everyone's body language betrayed the shift. They leaned toward him. Their eyes flickered in his direction even when someone else was speaking. Their sentences slowed as if waiting for his reaction. Without saying a word, he had become the center of orbit. One executive tried to command attention by raising his voice. Another tried to crack a joke, hoping to ease the tension. But no matter what they did, the pull was undeniable. Every action curved back toward the man who sat still. That's when you realize power isn't about chasing, it's about drawing in. Gravity doesn't move. It makes everything else move toward it. You've felt this in your own life, haven't you? You've seen how people who rush to prove themselves get ignored, while the one who waits calm, composed, unbothered, gets all the respect. You've tried to explain yourself to make sure others understood, and yet the more you talked, the less they valued your words. But the one who withheld, who stayed mysterious, that's the person they obsessed over. The man in that room had mastered the art of being the anchor, not the pursuer. He didn't run after their approval. He forced them to orbit his silence. And in that orbit, they revealed their insecurities, their desperation, their hunger for validation. That's the invisible gravity you need to claim. Stop chasing. Stop begging. Stop over-explaining. Let the world come to you. If you've ever been tired of running in circles just to be noticed, then this lesson is for you. Stay with me. Subscribe now, because in the next chapter you'll see how silence doesn't just pull people in, it makes them confess secrets they swore they'd never reveal. Have you ever said something you instantly regretted just because the silence was unbearable? Have you ever confessed too much, overshared, or revealed your weaknesses, not because anyone asked, but because the quiet made you panic? Have you ever realized later that your words were used against you all because you couldn't hold the silence? Isn't it haunting to know that your own voice betrayed you? That's what unfolded in the boardroom. The silent man had done nothing but sit, watch, and breathe slowly. Yet, one by one, the executives began to speak more than they should. A finance director nervously admitted that some numbers weren't fully audited. A marketing lead, desperate to prove herself, blurted out details about an unfinished campaign that wasn't ready for exposure. Another, sweating under the weight of unbroken quiet, let slip a rumor about internal politics that had been hidden for months. No one demanded these admissions. No one asked a single question. They were not speaking to him. They were speaking to themselves, trying to fill the silence that felt like judgment. And here's the terrifying truth. Silence is a confession booth. People project their guilt, their anxiety, their insecurities into it. When you hold your tongue, they rush to explain themselves, to justify, to reveal. They give away the very things they swore they'd keep hidden. You've felt this, haven't you? You've been in conversations where you gave away too much, filling gaps with nervous chatter. You've revealed things you didn't want to, simply because you couldn't bear the quiet. And then later, you wished you had kept it all inside. The man in that room never asked for confessions, but he collected them like treasures. His silence didn't just unsettle them, it made them surrender leverage. And with every unnecessary word they spilled, his power grew heavier. That's the lesson silence doesn't demand, it extracts. If you've ever wanted to stop being the one who overshares and start being the one who listens while others reveal everything, then this is your moment. Stay with me. Subscribe now, because in the next chapter, we'll uncover the hunger that drives people to beg for recognition from the one who refuses to give it. Have you ever felt like no one truly sees you? Have you ever worked yourself to exhaustion, hoping for recognition only to be overlooked? Have you ever told your story, revealed your struggles, poured your heart out, only to realize they weren't really listening? Isn't it crushing when your deepest hunger is simply to be understood, but the more you chase it, the less it comes? That same hunger filled the boardroom. The executives had been rattled by silence, shaken by their own confessions. Now they turned to the silent man with desperate eyes. They wanted something from him, anything. A nod, a glance, a single word that said, "I hear you, I see you, you matter." So they began to perform. One boasted about quarterly gains, voice cracking with need. Another bragged about relationships with high-profile clients waiting for approval that never came. A third tried humor, hoping for a laugh that would mean acceptance. But the silent man gave them nothing. His face remained calm, unreadable. No smile, no nod, no validation. And in that refusal, their hunger grew unbearable. That's the paradox. Validation is like water to the thirsty. The more it is withheld, the more desperate people become to drink. You've felt this too, haven't you? You've given everything to earn someone's approval, a boss, a parent, a partner, only to realize their silence made you crave it even more. You bent yourself into shapes you didn't recognize just to hear the words, "I'm proud of you." But the words never came, and still you kept trying. That's the cruel brilliance of silence. By offering nothing, the silent man made himself the object of their obsession. Every executive in that room was no longer competing with each other. They were competing with his silence. They were no longer speaking for themselves, they were speaking for him. Here's the lesson. When you stop begging to be understood, the world starts begging to understand you. If you've ever been tired of chasing validation, this is your turning point. Stay with me. Subscribe now, because in the next chapter, you'll see how silence transforms from a strategy into a shield, a weapon that protects you from being dragged into battles you never needed to fight. Have you ever been dragged into arguments you didn't want to fight? Have you ever wasted hours defending yourself against accusations that didn't deserve a response? Have you ever walked away from a conversation thinking, "Why did I even explain myself? Why did I let them pull me into their game?" Isn't it exhausting realizing you gave away your energy just because you couldn't resist reacting? That's the trap most people fall into. And that's the trap the silent man refused to enter. In the boardroom, tension boiled. One executive finally snapped. He slammed the table, pointed a finger, and challenged the silent man directly. "What do you have to say? If you disagree, speak up." The room held its breath, waiting for a battle. But no battle came. The silent man didn't rise to the bait. He didn't argue. He didn't defend. He simply sat, his face calm, his body still, his silence unshaken. And in that refusal, the challenger looked smaller by the second, swinging wildly at a target that wouldn't swing back. His voice cracked. His anger echoed against the walls and came back empty. That was the twist. Silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Because here's the truth. The moment you react, you step into their frame. You play by their rules. But when you refuse to react, you flip the game entirely. You force them to fight shadows to expose their desperation while you conserve your power. You know this feeling. You've been cornered by someone's accusations, pulled into fights that drained you all because you thought you had to answer. You didn't. You never had to. Silence would have said more than any defense ever could. The silent man understood power isn't proven in noise, it's preserved in restraint. He won by not showing up to the fight at all. And that's your lesson. Stop rushing to defend, explain, or prove yourself. Let silence be your shield. Let others waste their energy while you keep yours. If you've ever wanted freedom from endless battles, this is your path. Stay with me. Subscribe now, because in the next chapter we'll explore the deepest fear silence creates, the fear of the unknown. Have you ever feared what you couldn't understand? Have you ever laid awake at night not scared of what you knew would happen, but terrified of what you didn't? Have you ever noticed how the uncertainty of silence is more frightening than any scream? Isn't it true? The unknown breaks us faster than the known? That's exactly what filled the boardroom. The silent man had sat still for hours. No clear opinion, no approval, no rejection. And the longer he stayed unreadable, the more the executives spun in their own paranoia. They whispered theories. They exchanged nervous glances. One wondered if he was secretly aligned with the CEO. Another feared he had come to expose them. A third imagined he already knew their weaknesses. He never said a word. Yet his absence of clarity became a storm of speculation. That's the power of the unknown. It forces people to invent their own monsters. His silence wasn't passive, it was deliberate. By refusing to show his hand, he let them create 100 hands for him. And every imagined motive, every invented story made him larger than life. You've felt this before. You've feared unanswered texts, unread expressions, unspoken words. You've obsessed over what someone might be thinking, replaying conversations, filling in blanks with your own worst doubts. The silence didn't just leave you wondering, it made you unravel yourself. That's why the man in that room dominated without lifting a finger. The unknown is terrifying because people can't prepare for it. And when they can't prepare, they panic. When they panic, they confess, they reveal, they surrender. Here's the lesson: you don't always need to show your cards. Sometimes the most powerful move is to let others torment themselves with questions you never answer. If you've ever been tired of being predictable, if you've ever wanted to be the one others whisper about, instead of the one scrambling to explain, this is your chance. Stay with me. Subscribe now, because in the next chapter, you'll witness how even a single word dropped at the perfect moment can hit harder than 1,000 speeches. Have you ever waited desperately for someone to say something, anything that could finally give you clarity? Have you ever hung on to silence so long that a single word felt like life or death? Have you ever realized that the most powerful voices are not the ones that speak the most, but the ones that speak the least? Isn't it painful when you've shouted to be heard, but the world pays more attention to one whisper than to your entire speech? That's the moment the boardroom reached. For hours, the silent man had said nothing. His stillness had turned into gravity. His quiet had become judgment. Executives who once dominated the space now fidgeted nervously, afraid of what he might say if he ever chose to. The silence had built to a breaking point, and then he spoke. Just one sentence. Calm, measured, delivered without force. Yet it sliced through the noise sharper than any outburst ever could. A question so simple, so precise that it exposed every weakness in the conversation. The room froze. No one dared to interrupt. The same people who had been shouting over each other just moments before now sat in stunned silence, hanging on every word that might follow. But nothing followed. He had said enough. That's the paradox. The less you speak, the more power your words carry. His first word wasn't just a sentence, it was an earthquake shaking the entire foundation of the meeting. You felt this too, haven't you? You've tried to argue, to explain, to fill silence with endless words, and they lost their weight. But the few times you held back, when you spoke only after restraint, those were the words that landed, the ones that stayed, the ones people remembered. The man in that room didn't win because he was loud. He won because his silence made his first word priceless. Here's your lesson. If you want your voice to matter, don't waste it. Make it rare. Make it earned. If you've ever longed for your words to actually stick, this is your chapter. Stay with me. Subscribe now, because in the next chapter, you'll see how the collapse of noise begins when silence crushes everything that once seemed so loud. Have you ever noticed how the loudest people often burn out the fastest? Have you ever watched someone dominate a room with noise, only to crumble when silence finally arrived? Have you ever realized that most shouting isn't confidence, it's desperation dressed up as strength? Isn't it painful to know you've spent so much energy proving yourself, while the one who says almost nothing wins without effort? That was the breaking point in the boardroom. For hours, executives had competed, boasting numbers, spinning strategies, raising their voices like warriors on a battlefield. But after the silent man's first word, calm, cutting, undeniable, the noise began to collapse. The arguments that once seemed powerful now sounded hollow. The laughter that once filled the room now echoed like nervous chatter. The loudest man in the room, the one who had slammed his fist against the table, tried to push back again. But this time his voice cracked. His words stumbled. He looked less like a leader and more like a child throwing a tantrum. The more he shouted, the more invisible he became. The silence surrounding him was too heavy, too absolute. That was the twist. Silence didn't just expose weakness, it erased noise. It made everything else irrelevant. The executives shifted in their chairs. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked at the silent man, waiting, hoping he would speak again. The hierarchy had flipped. The people who once demanded attention were now begging for it. And the one who gave almost nothing had taken it all. You know this truth deep down. You've seen people crumble when their bluff was met with quiet. You've felt the exhaustion of arguing too much, explaining too hard, performing too often. And you've envied the calm, steady presence of someone who didn't have to prove anything and somehow still won. The man in that room understood noise collapses under its own weight. Silence used well doesn't just hold power, it consumes it. If you've ever wanted to stop wasting your energy and start commanding real presence, this is your moment. Stay with me. Subscribe now, because in the next chapter, we'll uncover how even a single glance without a word can weigh more than an entire speech. Have you ever been crushed by someone's stare? Have you ever felt your confidence disappear? Not because of what was said, but because of what was left unsaid. Have you ever walked away from a room replaying that single look, haunted by the way it made you feel smaller than you wanted to admit? Isn't it painful knowing that sometimes a glance carries more weight than an entire speech? That was the next moment in the boardroom. The noise had collapsed. The executives were quiet, waiting, restless. Then the silent man raised his eyes. Just one slow, deliberate sweep across the table. He didn't blink. He didn't frown. He didn't smile. His face gave nothing away, but that nothing carried the weight of everything. The first to break was the man who had been loudest all day. He shifted in his chair, tugged at his tie, looked down at his papers like a schoolboy caught cheating on a test. Another executive cleared her throat, trying to hide her discomfort. A third leaned back, arms crossed, but his foot tapped nervously beneath the table, betraying his calm facade. All of it triggered by one glance. That's the paradox. Words can be debated, argued, dismissed. But a look cannot be erased. It lingers. It follows you long after the room is empty. Silence paired with a glance forces people to confront themselves. It doesn't tell them what you think, it makes them wonder. And the wondering is what destroys them. You've felt this too. A parent's look of disappointment that stung more than any punishment. A boss's glance across the meeting table that made you question everything you just said. A stranger's steady eyes that made you nervous without reason. Deep down, you knew the glance said more than words ever could. The man in that room understood this law. He didn't need speeches. He didn't need noise. With a glance, he held the entire table hostage. Here's the lesson. Control your eyes and you control the room. If you've ever wanted your presence to speak louder than your words, this is your time. Stay with me. Subscribe now, because in the next chapter you'll see how silence itself becomes judgment. The invisible court where people convict themselves without you saying a thing. Have you ever felt judged without a word being spoken? Have you ever walked into a room and felt eyes on you, even though no one said a thing? Have you ever confessed your mistakes, not because anyone demanded it, but because the silence felt like a verdict you couldn't escape? Isn't it crushing to realize that silence more than words can become the harshest judge? That's what happened in the boardroom. By now, the silent man had barely moved, but his presence had grown unbearable. Every executive could feel it, the weight of his restraint, the way he gave nothing, no reaction, no approval. The silence itself became a courtroom, and they were the defendants. One executive voice, trembling, began to justify decisions no one had questioned. Another blurted out reasons for budget overruns, as if pleading with an invisible jury. A third apologized outright, confessing to shortcuts he had taken in the last quarter. The silent man hadn't asked. He hadn't accused. But the silence demanded answers. That's the paradox. People can resist words, but they crumble under silence. Because silence doesn't argue, it forces you to argue with yourself. It doesn't point fingers, it makes you point them inward. You've lived this too, haven't you? You've sat across from someone who said nothing, and suddenly you felt the urge to explain yourself, even if you were innocent. You've rambled in job interviews, on first dates, in tough conversations, because the silence made you feel guilty, exposed, inadequate. Deep down, you weren't defending yourself against them. You were defending yourself against your own fear. The man in that room didn't need to accuse them of weakness. They did it for him. His silence turned into judgment, and his judgment turned into control. Here's the lesson. When you learn to let silence do the talking, people reveal everything you never had to ask. If you've ever wanted to stop being on trial and start becoming the judge, this is your chance. Stay with me. Subscribe now, because in the final chapter you'll see how silence doesn't just rule a room, it builds a throne, and only the one strong enough to sit on it becomes unforgettable. Have you ever dreamed of commanding respect without begging for it? Have you ever wished people would finally listen to you? Not because you shouted, but because you didn't need to. Have you ever wanted to walk into a room and have the whole space bend to your presence? Isn't it painful that you've spent years proving yourself, while the ones who barely say a word sit on the throne you thought belonged to you? That's where the boardroom ended. The executives, once loud and restless, now sat frozen. Their noise had collapsed. Their confessions had spilled. Their hunger for approval had betrayed them. And at the center of it all was the man who had spoken almost nothing. He didn't demand authority. He didn't fight for the crown. By refusing to play their game, he became the game. By offering nothing, they gave him everything. When he finally stood, the room shifted. No applause, no declarations. Just a quiet recognition that the throne belonged to him. Not because he asked, but because no one else had the strength to hold it. Silence had crowned him. That's the final law. True power isn't taken, it's surrendered to the one who needs nothing. You've felt this truth in your own life. The people who over-explain, overshare, overpromise, they lose respect. The ones who speak rarely, who hold back, who let others scramble for their attention, those are the ones who are remembered. That's the throne silence builds. And here's your choice. Keep wasting your breath trying to prove yourself to people who never cared, or step into silence and let them come to you. The man in that boardroom didn't win by shouting. He won by sitting still, by letting restraint turn into gravity, by letting absence become presence. He walked out without a word, but his name remained in the room. That's the throne. That's the legacy. If you've ever wanted to stop chasing and start ruling, this is your moment. Stay with me. Subscribe now, because this is not the end. It's only the beginning of learning how silence can turn into your greatest weapon, your greatest shield, and your crown.